this is something that has to be pursued politically and something that I'm actively engaged in at the moment with regard to the political scene. At present, the coalition agreement muttered something about this. There's nothing that the government has done since the coalition agreement was set up has produced anything in this area. That's unacceptable, and I have told people from the bottom to the top of the government, and they know after them. And that's important, obviously, particularly when we have a Prime Minister who makes a speech in Germany calling for integration, and yet endorses legislation, existing legislation and new legislation that permits, indeed encourages, the segregation of children in school. It's just a remarkable hypocrisy. Just showing that secularists sometimes act in the interests of Catholics, obviously amending the Act of Settlement to remove discrimination against Catholic and the anti-Catholic language, which you'd think they would agree with. But I had this private members bill that sought to do that, and then the discrimination against women in the royal lineage, as it were, as symbolic. I don't feel strongly that they're an oppressed minority. The one MP that spoke out against both limbs of that proposal was the Catholic woman Anne Widdecombe. So I knew I was in the right territory. And she's coming to interview me on the 9th of March, so seconds out. Neutral public services. This is important again, particularly with the drive to have more in this. How can I be polite about the big society? I can't be polite about the big society. So this nonsense nebulous concept of the big society contains within it a plan to have more public services run by community groups. And it would be wrong, I put it to you, to exclude groups that are religious from running things that other groups can, but we need to safeguard. And these three safeguards: they're not allowed to discriminate against their employees, they're not allowed to withhold services from users on religious or sexual grounds, sexual orientation grounds, they're not allowed to proselytise when delivering that service. I think that's eminently reasonable when you talk about soup kitchens, or hostels, or meals on wheels, or care homes, or care services. And if they can't do that, that means that there may be less enthusiasm for religious organisations to provide these services. And I will not weep if that's the case. Non-discrimination in public services, Part 2. Limiting the right of religious people delivering public services to conscientiously object to rare and specific instances agreed by Parliament. Okay? So, pragmatically and probably philosophically, I think one can make a case that when it's on the one hand murder and on the other hand public service, then it would be wrong to prevent doctors, for example, from opting out and providing abortion services, or indeed assisted dying, if that came to it. And I think certainly pragmatically it's necessary to have a strong pro-choice and to change the law on assisted dying, that a conscientious objection is allowed, but not in other areas unless Parliament says that it wants to see marriage registrars start saying that they don't want to provide services for gay couples. And then we will be able to argue in Parliament about the situation where a religion says they don't want to provide for mixed race marriages, and see how the bishops get on with arguing the distinction. Limited adjustments only for religious practice, that speaks for itself. I think it is reasonable to make reasonable adjustment to cater for religious practice and employment or in facilities, but not, the words involved are important, to extend this to a blanket religious exemption based on subjective feelings. So you can't have someone saying they feel their religion gives them the right to breach a uniform policy, because maybe people feel so strongly about their politics that they want to wear a political badge on their uniform, and that's why the Awada case failed. This is the British Airways worker who was not allowed to breach the uniform policy in respect of wearing a cross or crucifix on her uniform, because they couldn't find a single other person who said that it was a requirement of the religion to wear outwardly such a symbol. And also, we must avoid imposing religious practice on non-believers, and then we're getting into halal and so forth. Didn't have time in the article to set that out, and more work's needed in there. Neutral education. This is, again, this is something that should be being introduced in policy terms, given the manifesto of one of the parties in coalition. Cease religious inculcation by the state by ending compulsory worship in schools, and making religious education the study of what religions and other belief systems believe, rather than instruction on what to believe. And that can only be ensured by having a national curriculum that makes that clear, and having it properly inspected by neutral inspectors, not religious inspectors. Neutral state institutions, and that's disestablishment, which is actually, I think, a low priority because it doesn't have many practical effects. It's more symbolic, and people don't see it as having practical effects. Ending prayer in the parliamentary or council chamber, and abolishing bishops automatically sitting in the House of Lords. I mean, there is going to be proposals for Lords reform in this Parliament, and it will be interesting to see whether the Liberal Democrats can persuade the other parties as their position that there should be 100% elected, and even if there isn't 100% elected, there shouldn't be reserved seats for conservative-minded elderly men, because there's enough of those in the House of Lords and in the House of Commons. Non-religious legal system. So we resist the imposition of parallel legal systems based on scripture, or the legal presumption that religious people are any more or less moral than non-believers. I hope that captures in your mind the Sherry Booth assertion that she was going to be more, she was going to recognise as a mitigating factor in sentencing the fact that someone guilty of, I think, grievous bodily harm was religious. I'm not sure that the victims of the Inquisition would recognise that distinction. And in terms of these, the issue of Sharia courts and Beth Din, it's important that we get this right. It's not simple about saying we should get rid of them. People are entitled under our law to have arbitration. Okay? But when arbitration has legal consequences, they bring the arbitration settlement to the court. And what I've said, and what my party said in opposition, was that we require, I think, two things in public policy in this area. Firstly, our courts to look behind a superficial decision to see whether it was fairly reached, particularly if it does appear to be less fair to the woman, usually, as they are, than a civil agreement would have been. Okay? Not to just take it at face value. And secondly, that our politicians and public policy should have a duty to urge women in particular to choose the civil, secular route. Okay? Not just to laissez-faire, leave it to the elders, but to empower women in those communities to recognise and to recognise that they have a civil option, a secular option, and to use it. But again, maybe there's work to be done on that. And then better integration. Work to end segregation of people based on religious dividing lines. This is a bit more nebulous, but it means talking not about communities defined by default by religious belief, because that just tends to encourage that. And we have this issue around the positive duty in respect of public services, or with respect to public authorities, which now extends to religion. And there's a danger that public authorities will think that they have a duty to provide discrete religious services for religious communities. So a Jewish care home, a Muslim care home, a Christian care home, and who knows, Jewish Meals on Wheels service, a Muslim Meals on Wheels service. And that's why, harking back to this issue about non-discrimination in public services, it's very important that we don't allow religious providers of public services to discriminate. Okay? And the Labour minister always used to say to me when I put this amendment down, well, what about Jewish care homes? So what I say to them, and what I've said to the Board of Deputies is, if a care home wants to provide a kosher service, fine. And restrictions on what services are available on a Saturday, fine. Okay? And it may well be that that mainly appeals to Orthodox Jews. But you don't put on the door, no Muslims need apply. Okay? that is different from providing a bespoke service to excluding people on the grounds of religion. And the danger of that being allowed is that with this public sector duty to have equal opportunity on religious grounds, which is flawed in itself, means that as soon as that happens, then another religion will say, well, we want our own, and we will have segregation. We already have it in schooling, we mustn't have it elsewhere. Just a couple of thoughts. We've got to be very clear that none of what I'm talking about has anything to do with doctrinal matters about women bishops, except in the sense that the Church of England is established, and one of the arguments against having an established church is why should our state be associated with misogyny and homophobia. Okay, so, but if the Church of England sort themselves out, that's a weaker point, but none of this is to do with that, and nor does it involve the banning of religious opinion from the public square. There are plenty of people in Parliament, in public debate, who are religiously motivated, and many of them are good people, some of them are dodgy, and they're entitled to have their say. And indeed, we want to maximise religious freedom of expression. And none of it engages with what families get up to in their home, or religious leaders within their own families. That's their business from a public policy point of view. There are some people, some indeed here, who feel strongly about when children are described as a certain religion and what families do in terms of religious inculcation. But in terms of public policy and in terms of having a neutral public policy, that is not part of this. And it's important to stress that so that we don't feel people who we need to have as partners in this don't feel that we are hostile to their interests. And as I said in the article, I think a lot of people can agree with the above who are then secularists, if you agree with all of that. But there's nothing in what I've said that is militant or aggressive. I'm a very mild-mannered person, except in my private life. And that's what I nearly said. And I think we need, as I say, we need to show that a secular manifesto, in all of its extent, is not aggressive or militant. In fact, we need to be very clear that the worst successes of secularism, things carried out in the name of secularism, involve dress bans mainly, and they're wrong, but I don't think they rank with what's carried out in the name of religion by religious regimes. So I hope I've provoked you to, with the extent of what is required to provide for a secular society. As I say, what I'm hoping to do is to help create a political campaign because it involves changing policy, that can move this forward. And it's a great pleasure for me to be followed by Naomi, who will say what the BHA is doing already in many of these areas and has been doing for years. And I pay tribute to how frustrating they must find it faced with the political class that they often are so often. Thank you.